The diner's bell jingled as a frail, elderly veteran walked in, his uniform jacket faded, his hands trembling. Emily watched as he scanned the menu, his eyes lingering on the cheapest item. Her chest tightened. When the bill came, he hesitated, fingers digging into an old, near-empty wallet. Something in her snapped. Before he could speak, she paid for his meal and walked away. The next day, the ground shook. Tanks roared up outside. Soldiers stormed in. Every eye turned to Emily. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, glancing around the nearly empty diner. It was late afternoon and the usual buzz of customers had faded, leaving only the soft hum of an old jukebox in the corner. She was about to head to the kitchen when the bell above the door jingled. She turned and saw him. An elderly man in a tattered military jacket shuffled inside. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if every movement carried the weight of a lifetime. His face was worn with deep lines, his gray hair unkempt, and his eyes, tired but sharp, moved carefully over the menu. Emily watched as he took a seat by the window, his fingers smoothing out the creases in the laminated menu like it was something fragile. She had seen struggling customers before, but there was something about this man that made her pause. The way his fingers trembled as he picked up a glass of water. The way his eyes lingered a second too long on the cheapest item on the menu. Then came the moment that hit her like a punch to the chest. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a battered old wallet. He opened it slowly, carefully, as if hoping more money would magically appear. His fingers shuffled through a few crumpled bills, pausing, hesitating. Then with a quiet sigh, he placed the menu down and began folding the wallet closed. Emily did not even think. She moved before doubt could creep in, before the reality of her own struggles, late rent, overdue bills, extra shifts, could stop her. She walked straight to the counter, pulled out her own tips from the night, and nodded toward the cook. "His meal is on me," she said softly. The cook glanced at the man, then back at her, nodding in understanding. When the man finally called her over to place his order, she smiled as if nothing had happened. "I'll just take the soup," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "No problem at all," she replied. Minutes later, when the steaming bowl was placed in front of him, he reached for his wallet again. But before he could pull out a single bill, Emily stepped forward. "Already taken care of, sir," she said gently. His hand froze over his wallet. His eyes, clouded with years of experience, widened slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked, voice hoarse. She just smiled. "Someone covered it for you." The veteran swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he looked at her. Then slowly he nodded, his fingers pressing over his heart in a silent thank you. For Emily, it was a small act, just another moment of kindness in a world that often felt too cruel. She had no idea that by the next morning, the entire world would know her name. Emily arrived at the diner early the next morning, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as she tied her apron around her waist. It was supposed to be just another normal day. But then, the ground shook. The windows rattled. The coffee cups on the counter trembled. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the streets like rolling thunder. Emily's heart pounded as she turned toward the front door. And then she saw them. Tanks. Actual military tanks. A convoy of massive armored vehicles was rolling down the street, engines growling, their sheer size making the pavement tremble beneath them. Behind them, several military jeeps followed in formation. Soldiers in full uniform stood in the open hatches, their eyes scanning the area. The few customers inside the diner froze. Conversations stopped. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere in the back. Emily's breath caught in her throat. What is happening? The tanks came to a slow, deliberate stop right in front of the diner. A second later, the doors of the jeeps swung open. Soldiers stepped out in perfect synchronization, their boots hitting the pavement with authority. Every single one of them turned toward the diner, toward her. The door burst open, and a tall man in a decorated military uniform stepped inside. His face was stern, unreadable, but his presence commanded the room. The few customers inside shrank back, eyes darting between him and the massive show of force outside. Emily could not move, could not speak. The officer's eyes locked onto hers. "Are you Emily Carter?" he asked, his voice firm. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Yes." For a moment there was silence. The weight of a dozen eyes pressed down on her, waiting, anticipating. Then the officer did something that no one expected. He snapped to attention. Then he saluted her. The soldiers behind him did the same, their movements sharp, precise, filled with unwavering respect. Emily's breath hitched. I I don't understand." The officer took a deep breath. "Miss Carter, the man you helped yesterday, he was not just any veteran." Emily's mind raced. "What?" "He is a legend, a war hero, a man who saved countless lives in service to this country," the officer continued. "And when he told us what you did for him, there was no way we could ignore it." Emily's hands trembled. This had to be a dream. None of this felt real. The officer smiled slightly. "He made a request," he said. "And when a man like him makes a request, we listen." Emily's mouth went dry. A request? Before she could ask, the officer reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. "Read this." Emily hesitated, her fingers shaking as she took the note and carefully unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words. And then, her legs nearly gave out beneath her, because written in strong, determined handwriting were just 4 words. "Take care of her." Tears burned in Emily's eyes as she looked up at the officer, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does this mean?" The officer smiled. "It means, Miss Carter, you just changed your life forever." Emily's fingers gripped the note tightly as the words blurred behind the tears welling in her eyes. "Take care of her." She swallowed hard, her gaze darting from the officer to the tank still stationed outside. The entire town was staring, people gathering on the sidewalks, whispering, pointing, their phones out recording. This was real. This was actually happening. Emily forced herself to speak. I do not understand. Why would he?" The officer's expression softened. "Miss Carter, the man you helped yesterday is Colonel James Reynolds." Emily blinked. The name meant nothing to her, but judging by the way the officer said it, with reverence, she knew it should. "He is a decorated war hero," the officer continued, "one of the most respected men in the military. He led missions that saved hundreds of soldiers, risked his life over and over again. And yet, when we met him last night, do you know what he said?" Emily shook her head. The officer took a deep breath. "I was just another old man to them, until that girl reminded me I still mattered." A lump formed in Emily's throat. The officer continued. "He told us that no one had shown him that kind of kindness in years. That simple act, paying for his meal, meant more to him than you could ever imagine." Emily's chest tightened. "I did not do it for recognition. He looked like he needed it." The officer nodded. "That is exactly why he wanted to do this for you." Emily's brow furrowed. "Do what?" The officer motioned to one of the soldiers outside. The man disappeared for a moment before returning, carrying a briefcase. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The soldier stepped forward, placing the briefcase on the nearest table. The officer reached down, unclasped the locks, and slowly lifted the lid. Emily's breath left her body. Inside the case was money, stacks of it. More money than she had ever seen in her life. Emily staggered back. What is this?" The officer smiled. "Colonel Reynolds insisted on repaying your kindness in full. He wanted to make sure you never had to struggle again." Emily's mind spun. This had to be a mistake. This could not be for her. I cannot accept this." The officer's face turned serious. "It is not a gift, Miss Carter. It is a request from a man who dedicated his life to this country and sees you as someone worth investing in." Emily's hands trembled. Rent, bills, medical expenses for her mother, her dreams of going back to school. Everything could change with this. But before she could say another word, the officer reached into the briefcase and pulled out something else, a folded American flag. Emily's breath hitched. The officer gently placed it in her hands. "He also asked us to give you this. He said, 'She reminded me of what I fought for.'" Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. The entire diner was silent. Even the customers who had been watching with wide eyes seemed to hold their breath. Emily wiped her face, trying to process everything. The weight of the flag, the meaning behind it, was heavier than she could have imagined. She clutched it to her chest, her heart pounding. What? What happens now? She whispered. The officer smiled. Now, Miss Carter, you step into a future you never saw coming. Emily stood frozen, her hands clutching the folded American flag, her heart slamming against her ribs. This was too much, too unreal. Just yesterday, she was worrying about tips, rent, and whether she could afford gas for the week. Now tanks were outside her diner. Soldiers had saluted her, and she was staring at a briefcase full of money because a war hero thought her small act of kindness was worth everything. Her throat was tight as she shook her head. I do not know if I can accept this. The officer nodded as if he expected her to say that. I understand, Miss Carter, but let me ask you something. Emily met his eyes. If it had been reversed, if Colonel Reynolds had been the one with money and you were the one in need, what do you think he would have done? Emily did not even have to think. He would have helped. She knew that now. He was the kind of man who had risked his life for others, the kind of man who had never expected anything in return, just like she had never expected anything when she paid for his meal. The lump in her throat grew. She looked down at the briefcase. This was not just money. It was an opportunity, a second chance, a future she never thought she would have. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time she let them fall. Slowly she nodded. All right, I will accept it, but only if you promise me something. The officer raised an eyebrow. What is that? Emily straightened her shoulders. Tell Colonel Reynolds that his life still matters, that people still care about him, and that I will do everything I can to honor what he did for this country. The officer's expression softened. He gave a firm nod. I will personally make sure he knows. A warmth spread through Emily's chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she was more than just a struggling waitress. The officer gestured to the soldiers outside, and within moments they moved with perfect precision, loading back into their vehicles. The tanks roared to life, the street trembling beneath their power as they prepared to leave. But before the officer turned to go, he handed her one final envelope. This is from him, too, he said. Emily hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper, and when she read the words, she gasped. If you ever need anything, you call me. James Reynolds. Below it, written in strong, steady handwriting, was a phone number. Emily pressed a hand to her mouth. She had not just gained financial security today, she had gained something else. A friend, a protector, someone who had spent his whole life fighting for others, and now he was fighting for her. As the tanks pulled away, the entire town still in stunned silence, Emily exhaled. Her life would never be the same again, and she was ready.